for? It felt mighty good to be carrying that fish home for Dad to see, although it kept I kept wondering that Mom would say what Mom would say about my wrinkled overalls. They'd be pressed so nicely when they'd been pressed so nicely when I'd left the house. But Mom was as good a mother as Dad was a good father. She was standing in the kitchen doorway when I came up past the barn and garden carrying my black bass, the fishing pole, and the bait can. Dad was washing his face and hands in the big wash basin under our grape arbor, which ran along the side of the garage. He straightened up with soap suds all over his face and neck and looked me over from head to foot. His eyes lit up proudly when I held up the fish. "It's wonderful!" Dad said. "They're terrible," Mom said. Dad was looking at the fish and Mom was looking at my soiled overalls. I didn't have a chance to be either glad or sad, now did I? But I was worried some just the same, because I didn't want to make Mom feel bad. "I'll wash them myself," I said. "You won't need washing," Dad said, only skin it and clean it." Meaning the fish, of course, not me. Just then the telephone rang and Mom had to go answer it, so I had a minute to be happy about my fish. Dad brought a ruler and measured it. 10 1/2 inches, he said, and he gave me the other half of that hug he'd started to give me earlier in the afternoon. Supper was ready right away, and as soon as I had washed my face and hands and combed my hair, we sat down to eat. I was still feeling kind of heavy around the heart on account of the overalls, even though I was as cheerful as anything on the outside and hungry as a bear on the inside. Mom's big, soft brown eyes kept watching me. We all bowed our heads quietly before eating. Hungry as I was, I kept my eyes shut all the time Dad was praying, which wasn't very long. Dad knew how hungry a boy could get at mealtime, and most of the time. He was a boy once himself. Oh, Dad was a real Christian, all right. I knew that not only because he prayed and read his Bible and went to church, but because he acted like one towards Mom and me and everybody else. I was just itching to tell them the whole story about how I caught the fish, that is, how Dragonfly and I caught it, but I couldn't on account of not wanting Mom to know I fell in the creek. But pretty soon, when she was waiting on the table and pouring a second glass of milk for me, she reached down and kissed the top of my head, just as though I was a little boy. And she whispered in my ear, "Don't worry, Billy boy. I know you didn't do it on purpose." Then she went around to her chair and sat down again. After that, it was the easiest thing in the world to talk. Dad laughed and laughed and wiped his eyes over Dragonfly and me falling into the water. That night, after I'd scrubbed my feet good and gone up to bed, calling good night at the top of the stairs, I stood beside my bed at a long time before getting down on my knees to say my prayers. I looked out the window at the moonlight shining on the barn and garage, the new garden. I could even see the little treetops of onions set in long rows across the garden. I looked up at the Milky Way stretched like a big white bow across the sky, and at all the thousands of stars. And I just kind of felt that God had made them, and I couldn't help but be glad that my dad and mom, who loved him and tried to teach me about him, somehow I couldn't help but think maybe he was like my mother and father, only more wonderful and a lot greater. He had made an awful pretty world, and he must have liked boys a lot because he sent his own son Jesus down to the earth to be a boy himself once. I knelt down and said my little poem prayer, and then added some words of my own, which I can't remember now. I felt like telling Jesus I loved him the way I did to my parents, and maybe even more. But I was scared to, but I did love him just the same, and I guess he could hear a boy's thoughts anyway, the same as his words, only it's good to use real words when you can. I tell you, that nice clean bed felt good even if it was hot. The pillows was so big and soft, only why, it was wet! No, not much, but as though someone had sprinkled a few drops of water on it. And that's how I found out I'd been crying a little bit. I hadn't known it at all. I sighed a great big happy sigh, and the next thing I knew, it was morning.